The clock is ticking on a fragile ceasefire and the window for peace is slamming shut. With less than 48 hours to go, talks are hanging by a thread. Will they happen or have they already collapsed? JD Vance, Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner are back to Islamabad for Truce Talks 2.0, but Tehran is digging in, pushing back hard and casting a long dark shadow over any hope of a breakthrough. In the last 24 hours, this crisis has taken a sharp and dangerous turn. The US Navy seized an Iranian-flagged vessel in the Arabian Sea, and Iran has called it maritime piracy, while warning of imminent retaliation. The Strait of Hormuz, the world's most critical oil choke point, is once again at the center of a volatile, high-stakes standoff. So tonight, are we watching the final moments of diplomacy or the first steps towards a much bigger, much more dangerous confrontation? Join us to decode this high-stakes moment. We have a special guest joining us in the broadcast. And joining me tonight on Newshour is Mr. Jason Greenblatt, former White House envoy to the Middle East in the first Trump administration, someone who's worked very, very closely with Donald Trump. I'm given to understand that Mr. Greenblatt has also written a book, In the Path of Abraham, and is also at the moment writing about the current war. Thank you very much, Mr. Greenblatt, for joining us here on the broadcast. Now, you have been talking about how people believe this is about escalation, how everybody is arguing about escalation, but that's not the real story. So give us a sneak peek into what the real story is.
Sure. Thanks for having me. So look, the issue is there's a disagreement in the world whether President Trump should or should not have done what he did. But the bottom line is Iran amassed potential nuclear weapons. They were building toward nuclear weapons. They clearly amassed a very large missile arena, missiles, right? They've been knocking them at the Gulf. They've been knocking them at Israel. And everyone wants to do business as usual and pretend those threats don't exist. President Trump has a very different attitude. He saw the threat. He recognized that the threat would become very difficult to fight. It would go underground and it would become even more difficult to actually stop the threat. So he went and attacked. And now the world has a choice. India, Europe, whoever it is that might disagree with President Trump. Either they join in, not necessarily militarily, but help protect the strait, keep the strait open, make sure that they're on side with President Trump so the threat is reduced. I don't want to say it could disappear. I don't think we'll ever make that type of threat disappear. Or they can just complain about what President Trump did, put their heads in the sand and forget about it and hope this just goes away. I don't think they should choose the second option.
Now, the critics of Donald Trump say that this was never America's war. America got involved because Israel is calling the shots. Since you've worked so closely with Donald Trump for over a decade, can you give us a sneak peek into his mind? What is he thinking? What must be his thought in the middle of this entire process of negotiation and, of course, the war?
Sure. I think that's a media talking point that people like to use. I worked for President Trump for 23 years. There is no way anybody, least of which Israel, could talk him into doing something he didn't believe was necessary to do. Did Israel share intelligence with President Trump? Of course, all countries do that. Did Israel explain the threat the way they saw it? Of course. How could they not? But nobody dragged President Trump into this war. This has been a long time in the planning, and I think that President Trump has strong convictions about the threat, and that's why he went to war. The only possibility is that perhaps the timeline for the war moved up by a little bit of time based on some new intelligence that Israel provided to President Trump. I don't know that that's actually what happened, but at best, that's what happened. I don't think any claim that Israel dragged or convinced President Trump to go to war when he didn't already want to do this is correct.
Right. So the logic that America is citing is that not allowing Iran to have a nuclear arsenal. The question is, does U.S. have a moral standing? That's what Iran has been asking. Does U.S. have a moral standing to make that commentary? Can U.S. decide that for Iran? And then also pointing out the nuclear warheads that U.S. has, or how many does Israel? How do you respond to that criticism?
I don't think it's a question of moral standing. I think the world is a safer place when responsible countries have nuclear weapons like the United States. And I think the world is an incredibly dangerous place when rogue regimes like the Iranian regime have nuclear weapons. To me, it's less about morality. It's more about keeping us all alive. The threat to the world is just, a huge threat if Iran or countries like Iran, irresponsible countries that threaten their neighbors, have a nuclear weapon.
Now, the US president, also spoke about ending an entire civilization. And then everyone saw that post about Jesus Christ. Can that be justified?
I don't waste time looking at tweets. He says what he says. I don't care really what he says. I care what he does. I care what his mission is, and I don't really pay attention to the noise. I saw days and days of news cycles on a tweet, and nothing really happened, right? So I think it's an interesting talking point to make once or twice, but spending time on it, I think, is not the issue of today.
But is the threat not a serious one? Does it not talk about his intention when he says that he will be ending an entire civilization?
I think you should judge him by what he does, not by what he tweets.
Okay. Isn't this exactly what, Donald Trump said he will not do? And I'm talking about engaging in forever wars.
So people have been saying this is a forever war from the minute that the war started. I'm also not receptive to arguments like that. Let's have a discussion in 6 months from now, maybe 4 months from now, maybe a year from now. Then we could talk about whether or not this is a forever war. I think that criticism, which is stirred up by the media, doesn't hold true at today's moment.
Do you believe that the round 2 of negotiations may lead to some sort of a breakthrough? Because even as we speak, there is no official confirmation coming in from the Iranian side. Maybe by the end of our conversation, there may be one.
Yeah, well, let's hope so. Look, I personally don't believe that the Iranian regime is ready to turn the page on this and change how it does business. I think they will always remain a threat. However, working for President Trump for 23 years, I never bet against him. So I certainly believe he's trying. I believe he might accomplish something, but I'm not going to put a lot of stock into the Iranian regime giving him the necessary deal.
So then what is the goal here? What is Donald Trump's agenda? Because we've heard a lot of statements, from regime change to ending and civilization to then saying that we are ready to talk. We've had some deep, meaningful talks with Iran to now the naval blockade. What is happening?
I don't think regime change is the goal. I think it would be great, but I don't think it's the goal. I think the major goal, of course, is the nuclear threat. I think he wants to eliminate that in its entirety. I think that the missile and drone threat is very, very important to him, both for Israel, but also for our GCC Arab and other Arab allies of the United States. And I think that the Strait, of course, has become very, very important. So to me, those are the 3 goals that he needs to be able to achieve. I don't think he's just going to give them relief for a temporary deal the way President Obama did under the JCPOA.
But Mr. Greenblatt, can threats and talks take place at the same time? Before the round 2 of talks, Donald Trump, in a very strongly worded post, said that if Iran does not agree to the deal that in Iran, then America is going to, hit out at every single power plant and every single bridge in Iran. Threats just before talks.
Yes, I think threats and talks can take place at the same time. Take a better example. Wars and talks take place at the same time. Countries fight each other, and you have diplomatic talks to see if you could end the talks. So if people get hung up over threats, as the Iranian regime is doing, they're wasting time. I think that if they want to draw a line in the sand and say they're not going to come to the talks until the threats end, that's just a silly statement on their part and a big mistake.
Well, Iran says that America has violated the ceasefire. They're also pointing out the naval blockade. And now, of course, seizing of an Iranian ship. They're highlighting all these issues to say that, America is not serious about negotiation. So can we really expect, can we really hope for a positive, meaningful conversation to take place?
If President Trump wanted to go back to war, he would have done so already. So I think they're missing an opportunity. I think Iran should take this period of time to take him seriously. There's no reason for President Trump to keep saying he wants to send the vice president to Islamabad for talks if he wanted to continue the war. So I think he's giving them the opportunity to talk. I think what they're doing is just making excuses because they don't want their feet to be put to the fire. They're not interested in making a real deal. I think they should. I think they should go there quickly and take advantage of the pause before President Trump decides that they're not serious. And as between the two sides deciding they're not serious, I think President Trump has the upper hand.
Well, you've also said that India is not a bystander as far as the entire West Asia conflict is concerned. So then how do you think, India can really help de-escalate the entire situation?
So what I think India should do is the opposite of what the Europeans are doing. The Europeans are throwing up their hands and saying, this is not our problem, this is not our fight, we didn't start the fight. And in the end, they're going to be severely damaged by it. I think India, in particular, the Prime Minister of India's strong relationship with President Trump, even though there've been some bumps in the road on the trade deal. I think India should stand by President Trump and explain that they understand that the Iranian regime is a threat to everybody, and they'd like to figure out how we can make it so that the Iranian regime will not be a threat and that they stand with President Trump. That's my personal opinion. I think being a bystander doesn't work given the stakes that India has in this fight.
Now, you know that there's a lot of commentary that happens around these statements, a lot of commentary on who has the upper hand, who has the edge. And critics of Donald Trump say that he is looking for an exit plan. This is a war that America was never anyways going to win. How do you respond to those critics? Also, they highlight the dwindling popularity, as per them, of Donald Trump.
Well, I'll go backwards. I think the dwindling popularity is actually not correct. I think anyone who hates him or people on the left are never going to like him. But I think his movement alone, despite some figureheads like Tucker Carlson, the MAGA movement is on board with this, and he is very popular. He remains very popular despite the war. In terms of, sorry, what was the first question?
Well,
the first part of the question.
Go ahead, please.
Yeah, sorry. What was the first part of the question?
Well, I was asking you about the future course of action, about Donald Trump not having an exit plan.
When you go to war, the exit plan is either to win or come up with a deal that makes sense, that puts away the reason you went to the war to begin with. I think he's not looking for an exit ramp that doesn't make sense. He's looking for an exit ramp that's going to stop Iran from being a threat to America, from being a threat to the region. That is his exit plan. So critics, when they say there's no off-ramp, off-ramps exist if you're dealing with a country that has logic and sense and wants to stay alive. Off-ramps sometimes don't exist if the country doesn't care. In my personal opinion, the Iranian regime just doesn't care. They want to burn everything else down. So I think the Iranian regime is the problem, and anyone who blames this on President Trump, I think, is looking at it the wrong way.
So what kind of a deal is America working on? Because you know the sticking points when it comes to nuclear rights. Is there going to be any forward movement in these talks? What is America planning to offer?
I think they're offering a cessation of the war, potential removal or reduction of sanctions and cash for a permanent end to the nuclear threat, but a permanent end, not the JCPOA type of permanent end, one that's fully verifiable, giving up all nuclear material, never doing it again. I think the missile threat for sure has to be addressed. I mean, if Iran could continue to just rebuild missiles and drones and attack its neighbors, Arab countries and Israel, that's not going to work. I don't think we'll ever be able to get a deal that fully buttons that down. It's just too easy to build missiles. It's certainly too easy and extremely cheap to build drones. But I still think we have to do the very best we could do on that. And I think some sort of way to make sure that the Strait of Hormuz is never held captive again by the Iranian regime.
All right. One last question to you, Mr. Greenblatt. Are we at a point of no return? Is there no going back from here? And, everyone, of course, is hoping that there is a breakthrough, that there's peace that prevails and everything can go back to normal. Iran says the Strait of Hormuz, at least, will never go back to the pre-war status. There'll be no normalization when it comes to the Strait of Hormuz. So in that case, are we looking at a prolonged war?
If Iran doesn't, well, I don't know that it takes a prolonged war to reopen the strait. It's certainly a very complex mission. But I think that's, again, to go back to your question about India, and I would bring Europe into this. If the world wants the Strait of Hormuz open, and if the world wants free waterways all over the world, not just the Strait of Hormuz, not making sure that this is done, not making sure that the strait remains open, is a big problem for the world. So Iran could say what it wants. I highly doubt President Trump will let this remain a problem. But I also think that countries that don't stand with President Trump as he tries to open the strait are going to have a problem down the road, because he believes firmly that the problem with the strait is much less an American problem and much more of a problem for other countries.
Okay, let me pack in one more question before I let you go. So this war started between US, Israel and Iran. It has reached directly or indirectly everyone else's doorstep. But are you saying, as far as Strait of Hormuz is concerned, the onus is on countries that rely on it the most and not US and Israel and Iran, of course?
Well, the U.S. is actually doing things. They're not going to do it. The U.S. may not want to do it by itself, but the U.S. is the one that at the moment is trying to keep the strait open. If the other countries don't want to be responsible and stand up and open the strait together with President Trump, we'll see what happens. I think he's angry about that. I think there will be consequences for countries, especially within Europe, who depend on it the most for not helping. But it's hard to predict that at the moment.
Okay, all right, Mr. Greenblatt, thank you very much for speaking with us. Thank you for taking the questions.
Thanks for having me.